Hello, everyone, and welcome again. Thank you for joining us for the Product Safety and Innovative Technologies webinar series. Today's session is Technology, Innovation, and Leadership in the Development of Safe Products. My name is Beth Ann Yacobu, and I am the Executive Director of the Emerson Leadership Institute, which is one of the centers of distinction in the Chaffetz School of Business at St. Louis University, and the hub for executive education and leadership training. Don Kornblatt is the president of ADK Information Services, our partner in product safety education and leadership development. Don and I enjoy developing the series of 4 topics to help product safety professionals broaden their perspectives and enhance their leadership skills by examining new and innovative technologies. We want to acknowledge and give a huge thank you to Amazon for their generous sponsorship of the program. Now, to help us present and moderate today's session, I'd like to introduce Lisa Trophy, a leader in the product safety industry and the managing director of the Juvenile Products Manufacturers Association. Lisa, thank you for guiding us through today's session.
Thank you, Beth Ann, and it is wonderful to be back here again today for this 3rd webinar in this terrific series about new technology and innovation. You know, we've heard from a number of industry titans over the past 2 webinars, and today is certainly no exception. We are very excited to share with you this session about technology, innovation, and leadership. We have great content in store for you. So before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping items for those of you joining us. And the first being the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions as you think of them. Our speaker will be sharing great information, and we will certainly have time to answer those questions at the end of the session today. Also, a quick reminder that when you exit the meeting, there will be a prompt for a very quick survey about your experience with us today. And we hope you'll take just a moment to answer a few questions there that will help us in planning future sessions. And finally, again, I would personally like to thank Amazon for their support of this series, and certainly we could not do it without their support. So thank you to Amazon. And without further ado, I am so pleased to introduce our speaker today, Michael Del Negro. Michael is the Chief Compliance Officer and Associate General Counsel at GE Appliances. Michael has more than 20 years experience in the product safety industry, and in his current role, he works tirelessly to inform the business on safety-related matters, including the development of safety processes to be used throughout the organization. Michael works with stakeholders at the federal, local, and regional level in order to work towards increasing safety measures, works tirelessly to advocate for legislative and regulatory initiatives, and he has a wealth of expertise in all of these matters. So, Michael, let's get started. We'll hear from you, and we'll work to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the session. So, take it away.
Great, Lisa. Thanks very much. That's the nicest introduction anyone could ever ask for. So you're very gracious. Thank you. And I'm really glad to be here today. I assume everybody can hear me. Lisa, you'll let me know if there's any audio. Great. Okay. So we're gonna go to the first page there, and I'm really happy to be here today with everybody virtually. And we had hoped to have a couple people on the panel. So I think what Lisa and I have worked out today is I'm going to talk for a little bit, and I have a roadmap that I'm going to share with the audience and kind of give you an overview of where I'd like to go. And Lisa is going to interrupt me whenever she wants and ask questions, whether they come from the audience or are sparked by something I say. So we're going to try to make this dynamic so you don't have to listen to me talk for too long. And while we're getting to the first page, the highlights of kind of where I want to go today a little bit are, I have a background in psychology. I was a graduate student for many years. I have a master's degree. And so although I'm a lawyer, I look at product safety not only through the lens of a lawyer, a product safety lawyer and professional, but someone who's worked with let's see, yeah, we're still on slide 3, but I work on organizational models and the kind of things that make companies successful over time and how they manage product safety. So you're going to hear a little bit about that in my comments today. I know that the seminar is focused heavily on technology, and I'll devote definitely time to talking about products, innovation, what that means. But if we only focus on product, we only focus on technology, that's really a piece of the safety puzzle. And I want to kind of round that out a little bit. So I will spend a little bit of time talking not only about product development, innovation. The slide you're seeing here is a preview, so you're getting a quick preview of what we're going to cover as an example. But I want to give you just a general roadmap, and then we'll talk a little about the organizational dynamics that work for companies over time, what works, what doesn't. There we go. And some of the communication challenges that arise in a cross-functional organization, which we all work in and we're all part of, where lawyers and engineers and other disciplines have to work together in near perfect harmony to problem solve, to think about critically about product development, and then on sort of the post-market side to know what to do when risks arise and how to act responsibly and do the right thing. So that's just kind of a quick overview. I'd like to give you, toward the end of the discussion, some specific examples of where innovation intersects with home appliances, around connected products. I think that's an area of interest. And talk a little bit more about future goals and what I think technology can bring in terms of safety. But let's start with, what are some of the promises and what are some of the risks of technology, and what does that mean as we think about product safety? Because if you listen to reports in media and you follow product recalls, we consistently see what appears to be companies that have good reputations who still struggle to get product safety right. And why is that the case? Why is it not simple to manage product safety in ways that are seen by others, by stakeholders, by consumer groups and others as successful over time? And the answer is it's because there's not one way to make products safe. And we're going to talk a little about what that looks like as product complexity increases. So that's kind of the roadmap. We'll start general, we'll give a specific example, and Lisa will interrupt me when she wants to. All right, can we go to the next page? There we go. So I want to start general. We're going to kind of funnel down to more specific example, but speaking generally, there are two competing views, the light and the dark. Technological optimism, which is that technology over time is, as populations grow, as lives get more complex, technology offers solutions, not only in efficiency, to give an appliance example. Appliances originally were seen as time saving, that they provide labor to households that traditionally were done, where the labor was primarily done by women, whether it was washing clothes or dishes. All that work was manually done for generations, and home appliances offered the promise of efficiency. And not just that in the sort of literal sense, but also freeing people up, freeing women up to do other things, and families and households to have other economic or other pursuits that were enriching. And so, that's one view. Technology is by many people seen as a solution, problem solver to issues. In this outlook, technology is seen essentially in an optimistic light, only its upsides. And whether it's listening to marketers or listening to engineers who talk about what technology can bring, innovation is kind of the key driving force behind this. And when you tinker, whether you're an individual at home who likes to work on clocks, or someone who on the weekend thinks you can install a ceiling fan, these are the promises that new products bring, and they excite and delight consumers. But in the safety context, there's another meaning to technological optimism, which is that technology is going to make the products we use safer and make consumers and users of those products safer in all the ways that they use them. So what do I mean by that? For example, when automobiles first came to be, and I know it's a vehicle, not a consumer product, but they provide a great utility, great efficiency. They were really not very safe. They had very few safety features, no seat belts, and the original seat belts were, not that great. They didn't really reduce risk that much. Over time, we evolved the safety features, but there was a lag between safety features and technological innovation. So there's an inherent tension here, right? So the optimistic view of technology is it's going to solve problems. And later in our discussion, we'll talk about some examples where in innovation and emerging technologies for connected products in particular, there are potential upsides. And some of those upsides are around notifications and product recalls. Some of them are monitoring product and giving consumers feedback so consumers can adjust behavior. I'll share with you my thoughts throughout the presentation. I welcome Lisa's comments too, but I fundamentally think one of the key topics that are discussed today is what's the role of consumer misuse? How should companies take that into account when they design product? What does that mean to think about consumer misuse? Are there limits to that? We won't go deep into that, but I think that's relevant as we're talking about emerging technology. So keep that in the back of your mind. We'll talk a little bit about that. And at the same time, think about the fact that a consumer, whether they're using a product in the household or in a playground, in what ways can the consumer be part of the safety equation? In what ways should they never have to be, right? In what ways should safety be handled by product designers in ways that anticipate foreseeable misuse? So we'll talk a little about that. Let's go to the next slide. So the competing view, the dark view of technology, is a pessimistic view. On the left here, this is just a little anecdote, but this is the view of what's called a singularity, which is that technology will, at some point in the distant future, outpace humanity's ability to keep up with it. That it'll effectively take over and reach a growth rate where technology is actually exponentially grown to a point where humans can no longer control or keep up with technological outcomes. And so the very walls of technology that we create, whether it's in aviation systems or heating and cooling and transmission of energy, whatever it is, or household products, that they will reach an inflection point beyond which humans won't have control over it in ways that don't lead to good outcomes. Some of the risks associated with technology is it's disruptive. One of the reasons people like new technologies is because they are seen as disruptive. If we look at autonomous vehicles, they're not really autonomous. They're on a distribution of features that begin with very simple features. I mean, the first autonomous features were things like cruise control, but today no one thinks of cruise control as an autonomous feature. But fundamentally, these are some of the biases that creep into technology. So, for example, there's a review, I think accurately held, that risk appraisals are hard to get accurately done, and that there's a tendency, a bias, if you will, to distort perceptions of risk. So as you're looking at risk, most of us we think we're good estimators of risk, but over time, it's really difficult to get that right. And as technology moves quickly in development, getting risks and understanding what those risks are, the implications, and what to do about them pose real challenges for organizations. We'll talk about some examples of that. And what does it mean to be poor risk evaluators? Everyone has a bias, whether you're an engineer or a lawyer by discipline or a business person who doesn't really think much about risk because you don't have specific training in that. But how is it that companies learn about these risks over time, and what does that look like? So sort of the dark side of technology that I think we have to acknowledge is that there are risks that come inherent in products. We accept those on balance because products provide enormous utility to people, and in ways that enhance, as I gave examples of earlier, home experiences, life experiences that are not just time saving, but do things that we would never have thought to do previously. All right. So let's just let that settle in. If folks have questions, they can feel free to ask those at this point. This is all kind of rather general, but I want to transition a little bit and talk about not just how to get things right organizationally. So we'll come back to innovation in a moment, but I want to spend a few minutes talking about how is it that companies can get off track, and what does it look like when they do? And so if you look at and I won't go into great details about examples. I think people can think of their own example that's relevant. But if you think about recalls that are widely criticized, and most recalls don't get generate a lot of attention today. It is really the rare product recall that is a media-worthy event, and I think that's important because consumers have gotten used to the execution of recalls. They know that product recalls happen. They are fundamentally not a bad thing. It's in my view, at least, not a breakdown necessarily of process. There are exceptions to that, of course, but it is, these are unanticipated risks that emerge as products become more complex, and not every risk can be designed away or discovered even in careful and thoughtful product development processes. So recalls are are an important part of a robust safety culture. I don't think they're a negative. I know that not all folks view it that way. But to me, a recall is a sign of a company that is willing to take responsibility and stand behind its product and consumers and do the right thing. But there are examples where certain elements within the organization over time, where we see the same kind of vulnerabilities occur that lead to particular bad outcomes, whether it's on product development or on the recall side. And so I've just kind of coalesced a few of these here, but to me, they really fall into three large buckets. And one is, what is the company's culture? Its organizational structure. How is safety organized within the company? What kind of processes does the company have to manage safety? Is that defined? Is that written down? And then some of the behavioral attributes. How do people talk about product safety? And what is the company's attitude toward it? And in almost every sort of safety case that's come up in the last decade, you see examples of all these things where you remember when a recall happens and there's inquiry into it, people are delving into the company, looking into company's files and records, and looking to see, what's been said about the company, what kind of communications employees have within the company around these things. And although it sounds silly, the way, the tone that people take, how they communicate around safety concerns, what is said or implied, those things come to light. And those behavioral attributes really reflect on, what does the company take seriously in its safety process. And it also says a lot about the company's culture. So consistently, and again, these are kind of general statements, but I think over time they've been shown to be really predictive of good outcomes in product safety. On the culture side, this is hard to define, but it's part of what the Department of Justice looks for when they're looking at corporate compliance programs. This is a company that gets it. I think the CPSC takes a similar approach of trying to understand a company's safety culture. Is this a company that really takes seriously that? And what's the evidence of that? Does it consistently implement good safety practices over time? And what does that look like? It's easy to say it. It's much harder to do it in ways that make organizational sense. So this slide is framed negatively to kind of tell a story here, but I'll offer some thoughts on ways that I think companies can do this that make sense. But starting at the top, organizations have to have a leader or leaders that care about safety. It has to be a priority, and it can't be a priority after something goes wrong. So companies have to really communicate that to a workforce. And how do you do that? Well, there are different ways to do it. But if you're a company that makes products and those products are used in a household and they're powered and have electricity and are used daily by consumers of all ages and abilities, you have to be able to anticipate why that's important and let your workforce know that that's important. You need to have cross-functional communication. And too often we work in silos in large companies, and our ability to talk to others, there's someone over there, I work in marketing, this person's an engineer, we speak totally different languages. And how do you cut through that so that we can all have a common language around safety? And one of the other risk areas is not having a clear process that people know about. Now, a process by itself doesn't guarantee good outcomes, but if you don't have a well-defined process and people are kind of guessing about what to do, if you get an incident report and you're not sure where to go, you lose time. Companies have to have a way to handle that anticipated data that will come in and know where to go with it. I flagged a couple things here on the right. If you look at some of the high-profile, vehicle recalls, there's certainly examples of this. As companies grow in size and complexity increases, the ability to communicate is hindered. And we've all seen people overwhelmed by email and information and data. So the question is, how do you detect the signal through the noise? This is an ongoing challenge for companies. There's no doubt. And yet some of us, we do it consistently over time. We do it through a couple different ways, but priority parts analysis is thinking critically about what can go wrong in a product. And if companies are capable of doing that in the design phase, that is a long way toward reducing risk in product. In children's products, things are done pretty prescriptively because of standards, and it's clear there are standards obviously in adult products as well. But companies have to think, well, in addition to the standard or beyond what the standard provides as protection, what else do we need to anticipate? We've talked about this at ICPHSO and other conferences, but virtually every non-children's product recall it's rare to see a recall where you have a non-compliance with a voluntary standard. Usually the voluntary standard is covered at the waterfront of risks, and there's some low frequency risk that emerges that results in a risk of injury or some other risk that results in the recall. So just being able to think critically about what are the things that could go wrong in the product, and then having a process to flag that, and then once you flag that, what to do about it on the design stage. At the bottom here, these kind of behavioral attributes, I mean, how do recalls happen? Well, if you've worked in a company, you know how they happen. It's not a mystery. On the other hand, companies have to think critically. They may take a position at a point in time and say, hey, this particular field issue is not a concern for us. Here's why. Maybe they're good at documenting that. Maybe they're not. But if they get new information, what do they do with it? So, we really think and talk a lot about internally, how do companies come back to an initial position they've taken and say, do we need to re-examine this and take our assumptions at that point in time in light of this new information? And just the ability to do that and to reconsider courses of action and decisions is really important. And just that flexibility to say, okay, this is new information. We didn't know this back then. How are we going to proceed? And acceptance of that across the organization. I don't have it on the page here, but I should have mentioned this at the outset, which is having a dedicated safety organization is, I think, kind of the price of entry for a robust safety culture. So if safety is a siloed job, if they are part of a product line with commitments, that's really kind of a inferior position in some ways, just in the sense that you can be beholden to commercial pressures. You don't have sort of the independent oversight. So robust safety culture starts in part with an organizational model that fosters safety. What does that look like? It looks like an independent system where there's oversight, there's checks and balances, just like any organization. So that usually means a lot of arguing, just like families arguing. But that's sometimes a good thing, and that's often how different points of view are heard, so that good decisions are made over time. Not perfect decisions, but good decisions over time that reduce risk. And that system of checks and balances also helps ensure an organizational culture that kind of gets it when we realize why we do these things. And that's part of what we'll talk to a little bit here. The issue of spotting red flags, again, the signal to the noise, this is really an important thing, is products surveillance. We're companies of all sizes are inundated with information. Nobody lacks for information. Consumer feedback has many different forms, and they come from retailers and dealers. It comes from directly from consumers. And that flow of information into companies is nonstop. Sometimes it's not really actionable. Sometimes it's anonymous. But other times there is information there to discern, and companies have to be set up to process that and not be tone deaf. They've got to be sort of nimble at times, recognize something's an issue, and know how to escalate it through processes. So all these elements here that I've shown are interrelated. If you have a safety culture that's kind of weak and there's a concern and the person is in the safety role and they raise the concern and there's not a respect for that or a process that listens to it, the organization just won't get it. They won't listen to that safety person. So, in our business model, we have a chief engineer and an office associated with that. And that's an organization that has a voice in the enterprise, and it's really important. And these are just some of the elements of this, but this is across all safety systems, whether it's consumer products or automotive. These are some of the elements organizationally that I think are increase the likelihood of good outcomes over time. And again, recalls happen, so I don't take this to mean that any one of these things has to be at all times robust. There's always room for improvement, and if we benchmarked across any business, we would always find areas that need improvement. Let me just pause there, see if Lisa, if you have any questions, or otherwise we'll go to the next slide.
Yeah, no audience questions yet, Michael, but that was such an interesting look at the juxtaposition of the safety culture in organizations as it pertains to the safety team. And, if we take it back one step to the team who is working on innovation and thinking about technology and trying to move quicker, if we think about organizational culture as a whole, maybe could you talk a minute about what those tensions could be between the product safety team and the the product safety implications, and how how can we maybe make improvements in our own organizations if we, don't feel like they're working well together?
Yeah. So what goes wrong? What are some of the pain points that companies deal with, and especially as innovation comes? So innovation means a couple different things, obviously, but it also means speed. And increasingly, we see products that come to market very quickly, that process today is iterative. There's a lot written about companies that want to fail fast and innovate, and that's part of the design process. I don't believe that any of the intent behind that is fail fast in ways that are unsafe. So fundamentally, I don't think there's a real tension between rapid innovation, development, new products, and if the safety cultural elements are in place, if that makes sense. So companies can do rapid innovation, they can do that kind of product development in ways that enhance safety outcomes, taking a certain kind of business risks, but not risks with safety. And there's a trade-off there. So when things break down, what does that look like? I think we know. I mean, it's fundamentally where incentives are either cost-based or there's some other incentives that are driving behavior in the organization that aren't conducive to safety outcomes. And we've seen examples of that. I really think communication is a big part of this, is knowing how to communicate cross-functionally when issues do arise, so that there's information, what are its implications, and what to do about it. On the innovation side, I think companies have to not think that moving fast means that they don't have to do things like an FMEA and think about failure mode analysis when they're developing electrical and electronic products. You can innovate quickly, but you can't leave a safety checklist on the floor. You've got to think about, still, how could this product be misused? Oh, I didn't intend it to be used in this way, but we know consumers will use it in ways we don't intend, and how can we design that risk out? Now, let's talk about that a little bit, because you can't eliminate all risk, and you don't want to. So I'll say it again a different way. There's certain risks that are inherent in products that we accept on balance, that's part of the utility of the product. Cooking, I'll come to an example a little bit later, but cooking is a good one. The industry, home appliance industry, has taken great steps to reduce risks associated with cooking. Yet and still, cooking is an inherently risky activity. You can burn your hands, you can burn yourself. There's risks associated with it. And if you diminish the risk too much, the utility would be eliminated. So we don't want that. We want risks and benefits that are reasonable. And that line is an evolving line over time. Okay. So for many years, and I know that in one of the prior discussions, there was talk of home cooking fires. The industry, home appliance industry, together with partners, including CPSC, including with the standards bodies, have made real strides in reducing the risks of unattended cooking fires. I would say historically, going back many, many years, there was a view that those were accidents and they were not preventable. And that view has shifted over time. There's been a paradigm shift, there's no question. Yet and still, there's a lot of utility that comes from cooking that consumers want and need. I mean, it's a reality of modern life. They cannot be completely made safe. And we don't want it to be completely made safe, because we want to have cooking features and functionality that are seen as desirable by consumers. So to get back to your question, Lisa, how do things break down and what does that look like? I think poor communication, poor cross-functional communication, cost pressures that get to trump other considerations, and just sort of not getting it. Having companies that don't realize that they're ultimately responsible to consumers and to other stakeholders when things happen that are unintended with their products. So you have to have that kind of awareness going into product development, and companies have to consider that throughout the design and life cycle use, including at end of life and recycle.
Great, thank you for that. One quick audience question before you move on.
Okay.
Got lots of interested folks here, and you just noted that poor communication, cost pressures, not being forward thinking are all things to really be mindful of in order to make sure that we're doing the right thing and the organization is working cohesively. And so the question that was asked here as sort of a follow-on to the first is, what can a safety professional do to fix a flawed system? So again, to poor communication, cost pressures, what can a lone safety individual in an organization do to be heard and to work toward change?
Yeah, so I think that's really an important question. It's a good one. What I would say is let's take the three bears approach, right? So if you work in a huge company and you're hired in you really hope that that has an organizational model, a safety model built into it. Because if it doesn't, and you're the lone woman or lone man or whatever in a large company, it's an uphill battle. You cannot push a rope uphill. So you can't, in a smaller company that maybe doesn't have, a lot of cross-functional divisions and maybe people do different roles. I think the potential to be an influencer, a teacher around safety is good. And there are lots of examples where people enter a new organization, and whether it's because their discipline and skill set or experience that they get through, external engagement, learn more about safety, bring that back to the company, have some teaching around it, and just kind of shape the thinking and the way the company thinks about these things outside of the crisis. Because nobody learns well in a crisis. And that's too often when companies are forced to learn some of these lessons that we're talking about. Is something will happen, go wrong, management or the board says, okay, now we have a problem. Independent groups come in and look at the company, maybe there's some benchmarking, and then they go fix it. But that's a really expensive way to learn some of the lessons and not the best way to do it. And so I think, if you're a safety manager, a director of safety, and you're sort of dropped into an organization, and the model that we're talking about is sort of partially there, but maybe not completely there. You have to tirelessly advocate for what you think is right. What's within the company's risk appetite to accept. Because if you come into an organization that is sort of change resistant and say, well, tomorrow I want you to do all of these things, make sure you have senior leader oversight, make sure you have a really robust written safety policy, make sure you never let cost or pressures to launch product get in the way, that's ignored, and that safety controls everything. I mean, you have to be realistic about how it's implemented. So I believe strongly in working within the organization to push for change where you think change is important, but to get leader buy-in for it. And then helping leaders see that this is not, companies are not pursuing safety because they're made to do it. It should be part of the core company's value that it's important, and it should mean something. And that should come from the CEO on down. So ideally, if you're, as I said, dropped into a medium-sized company of the three examples, small, medium, large, you're going to work with partners because you need partners. A safety person cannot do this alone. So one person cannot make a safety model work. It just doesn't. It depends on the company, of course, but it's in most of companies of any size, there's interdependence between a person as a safety manager and other functions and teams. So you have to make yourself indispensable and find ways to help show the company the importance of safety throughout the product lifecycle. And in some cases, that means some hard choices around what does that mean? What can or can't we do? What are the limits of what we want to do? Did I get at your question there, Lisa? You can totally ding me if you think I'm off base, okay? I won't be offended.
No, that was great information.
Okay.
And I think sometimes it can feel like an uphill battle, right? That's probably, where that question was coming from. But I think, working as a team and finding advocates who believe what you are speaking about and, working together as a team is really the way to go. So let's move on. We'll get back to your content and see what other questions we get.
Okay. And there's one other point that I'll just make too, which is that, what are companies expected to do in the face of uncertainty? And we'll come back to this in a little bit later, but there are times where we like to think, well, these decisions are simple. They're black and white. You see right and wrong, and the companies will do the right thing. But companies frequently deal with uncertainty, whether it's in design or post-market safety surveillance. And what are we expected to do? How should we act as a company when we're faced with uncertainty? Almost every product safety regime, whether it's in the US, Canada, Europe, all those regimes anticipate this issue. We've kind of talked about this in other settings, but if you have an organizational model that follows a precautionary principle that says, in the face of uncertainty, when there's a potential risk, either to the human health or safety or the environment, we're going to take a conservative measure, even if we're not sure. Sometimes that means things like when in doubt, report. That's one of the reasons that language, has made its way into guidance from CPSC over time. It's when faced with uncertainty about the magnitude of the risk, what should a company do about it? And that's where there's potential for a safety person to have influence and education around, okay, guys, I know it's not clear, but let's decide what we're going to do about it. So I think that's really important. Now, to get to this example here, we've been very general. I want to have some specific discussion now, Lisa, about what does innovation look like in home appliances? What's the innovation story? both today and as we move forward. Okay, so you know, if you follow the home appliance industry, not that we're, you know, there are many industries that are hugely important. We're happy to be one that's associated with hearth and home. We know our products are used every single day by consumers. In the pandemic, we've learned how much more that's true. You know, the need for appliances and being able to clean and sterilize the home has just been made more apparent as people spend more and more time at home. That is a reality of modern life. Connected products, you know, began their journey, just to go back a little bit to give some historical perspective, began their sort of journey very cautiously. You know, let's say go back maybe about almost 10 years when standards bodies began setting expectations around safety for a connected, smart enabled product, which again is communicating between us, you know, as I've sort of shown here on the slide, between the smartphone, the cloud, and the appliance. There's sort of an ecosystem that is sending signals and communicating. You know, what are the ways that that could be done safely? I've highlighted some of the features here, but these are just, you know, simple examples. I'm not trying to be comprehensive, but things that you can do with an appliance, voice activated commands to preheat an oven, to select recipes, to turn off an oven remotely, to send alerts around, you know, water temperatures, to know when your water filter needs to be replaced, stuff like that, that are, you know, helpful voice activated commands that enhance the appliance's functionality. But what does it not include? Okay, so what are some of the limits? And as I said, we started this journey very conservatively, meaning we knew that you know, being able to remotely activate a cooktop would be unsafe. The industry has long taken the view that cooking is an intended operation. There are exceptions to that for simmering and low temperature cooking that we all do. If you have a stew that you put on the back burner on low, consumers can safely do that without risking a cooking fire. But there are limits to the kind of functionality that we would allow, so that you know, connected use cannot make the appliance unsafe. So that sort of two parameters here. One is, you know, we don't want a functional input that makes results in an unsafe condition. So we don't want the ability to modify the opening of a gas valve or activating surface units on a cooktop. But even more fundamental than that, we don't want any connected input to change the appliance's existing electromechanical safeguards. So ovens are designed to contain cooking fires. The cavity of an oven is designed to hold for hours a runaway cooking condition. And as long as oxygen is not introduced into that environment, the risk of oven fires are safely contained in the oven. That's the goal. That's the objective from a design perspective. There's nothing in the way a connected oven works that should ever be allowed to compromise that hardwired safety functionality, if that makes sense. These are kind of basic examples. And then I won't get into it because it takes us down to the path of talking about security and IoT, and that was kind of a prior panel discussion. But these are some of the design practices from a cybersecurity standpoint to ensure that that ecosystem I mentioned between device, appliance, and the cloud, that communication triangle is safe and protected from a security standpoint. But fundamentally, we're not doing anything on a connected appliance that would compromise our view of how the appliance should behave from a safety perspective, if that makes sense. So that's a lot there. Let me just stop and just see if there are any questions.
So one question here that may pertain, and it's a big question, and I think it sort of connects to your previous slide as well. But if you're living in a system where the legal team has a lot of oversight over, you know, what types of decisions are being made at the risk level, how can we balance the cost from the legal perspective being too high to work to mitigate those risks that product team may be raising as a concern?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, you know, I'll put it this way. Most companies don't market safety because it's expected and it's a norm that the product would be safe for its intended use, including foreseeable misuse. So when you buy a bicycle, no one says this is a safe bicycle because consumers expect the bicycle to be safe. They know there's certain risks in riding a bicycle that are inherent. That's why we all wear helmets, hopefully, even if we did not when we were kids, but that's why we should wear helmets. But it's important to remember that safety is not a given, that you have to design it into the product, and that there are real business consequences and reputational consequences and consumer consequences for not getting it right. And I think, if you're a safety manager in an organization, if you can find ways to persuasively and objectively tell those stories to companies, to management over time, outside of, again, of a crisis, when learning is, people are more receptive to learn, that those are the ways to make the case for why, even if safety costs a little bit more, it makes sense to do. And there are lots of examples that are, we can take to use to teach these kind of lessons. But I will say, it's really, from my perspective, I've been in the appliance industry for 10 years. It's rare to see cost as a discussion point. It's not that it doesn't happen. It's just that usually the issue is you're dealing with a risk that's very low frequency, and you're trying to decide what to do about that, coming back to the uncertainty element that we talked about. But I do more, internally. I think there are a lot of product safety professionals who are not lawyers. You don't need to be a lawyer to be in the role, but you have to know how to talk to other disciplines, and that's kind of the key, is knowing how to work cross functionally. I jokingly talk about how engineers and lawyers work together in happy harmony. That's obviously not true, but that's because they speak very different languages around safety, and approach it very differently. But that doesn't mean each side is wrong in their perspective. We have to find ways to kind of communicate across that divide. So maybe I'm not answering your question directly, but I think it's important to be able to say, yeah, we're going to need to do this, and then maybe there is a cost impact, but at the end of the day, we're reducing risk over time, and that's protecting the company, the brand, and most importantly, the consumer. Because fundamentally, at the outset, companies do want to do the right thing. Sometimes, depending on where they are in the maturity level, this is really a question of how mature is the company's safety process and safety culture. This gets back to that organizational model we talked about. And companies that may think they're fine because nothing has gone wrong does not mean that they have a mature safety process or mature safety culture. Sometimes those are just latent vulnerabilities that haven't been exposed yet through a bad recall or some issue in the field, and that's where the learning occurs, unfortunately, after the fact. But those are tough lessons to learn when you have to learn it that way.
Certainly seems to be a theme, isn't it? That we need to ensure we're using data, communicating appropriately, telling the stories, and increasing safety. One more quick question here for this slide.
Okay.
You talked a bit about how smart technology specific to appliances is really an ecosystem of communication across apps, the technology, and this is happening in a lot of different industries. I work in the baby industry. We have smart monitors and all sorts of smart technology these days, which has been born of innovation. But as you noted early on, people can be poor risk evaluators. So when we're thinking about all this technology and this innovation that's speeding ahead of us in these very serious security potential ways, what is being done, or are there best practices out there that organizations should be thinking about as it relates to maintaining the integrity of the smart technology and the security that consumers expect when they bring these types of products into their homes?
Yeah, so a couple different questions there, but certainly on how do we ensure security so that there's not a breach? Fundamentally, we rely on, obviously, the safety inherent in the products, that we're not, we don't want a connected feature or functionality to ever modify the product's safety features, so that if we have redundancy in place to reduce risks that are foreseeable and that have been designed for that's the functionality of a connected feature doesn't change that. But how do we know that that's true, and how do we know that the security of that ecosystem is protected? Well, companies manage this. This is obviously a key area right now, but you constantly do testing to evaluate that. You can do penetration testing, and companies can expose products at conferences where they get hackers, white hat hackers, to give feedback on security vulnerabilities so that they can improve that process. That is highly iterative, and more so in some ways than safety, because it's just the cybersecurity, web and risks associated with that are rapidly evolving. If you talk to, folks who do that for a living, and that's not me, you'll hear that those, what's a good cybersecurity practice today is not a static thing. Standards, product safety standards are relatively static once they're evolved to address certain risks. In the cyber world, yes, there are standards, but it's more a series of best practices and criteria that are really evolving as we learn what the new threats are. And that landscape is really shifting very rapidly. But fundamentally, if you've got a good system in place on the safety side, the cybersecurity practices should not impact the safety of your product. Now, we've talked. There's some examples. If you have a smart enabled avalanche beacon, and it depends 100% for its functionality on its smart feature, and then that smart feature is compromised, then that product is an unsafe product. But that's when the connected feature is inherent in the utility of that. For most products, that's not the case. The smart feature is an additional level of functionality, but not the core safety element of the product. If that makes sense. So, there's a recall in Europe in the last 2 years for a watch that was a connected watch, a smart enabled watch that could be hacked. And it didn't have any other risk aside from the security vulnerability. Well, why was that recalled? It was a children's watch, and it was the kind of thing that could be used to locate the whereabouts of the child and pinpoint their location. So it was a recall because the cybersecurity vulnerability resulted in, potential compromise of the safety of the wearer. But that's an outlier. That's not the typical scenario. So I think companies just have to really aggressively, just like on safety, look at cybersecurity, test themselves routinely, go to conferences and get feedback from third parties, incentivize hackers who are willing, usually, young people who do this for a living, who are out there looking for ways to be the next best code writer to, expose security vulnerabilities and gain some notoriety for that. And then, companies can incentivize that by asking for feedback from consumers and white hat hackers on exactly that issue. So I'm just giving you some examples, Lisa, but those are some of the ways. But I think fundamentally, my takeaway point here is if companies are doing this right, whether it's in juvenile products or non-children's products, the cyber feature really should not intersect with the core safety and redundancy in the product if things are done as they should be.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go to the. All right, so I want to just kind of round out this phase of the discussion here, Lisa, with a couple of key takeaways. This is a forward-looking thing. This is sort of my prediction and what I'd like to leave the audience with here a little bit, which is, look, over time, there's been two discussions around connected products and appliances included. One is, will the connected feature create hazards that were unanticipated? Will it take a safe product and make it unsafe? We talked about that a little bit. The other is, what are the upsides of connected products? Is there any safety benefits or enhancements that consumers should expect? The answer is, we'll see over time. There will be, but that's still an evolving area. So I think companies that are going to do well in developing and innovating and around products will do a couple things really well. One is they'll make safety fundamentally a priority, and that'll come from the top of the company, and it won't be lip service. It'll really be some resources behind that. Companies that will do well in the space will have technology that they'll use to discover vulnerabilities that they hadn't anticipated, and those will be things that will feed into standards activities and improvements in safety standards, but also design changes that reduce risk over time. Another area here is, I've got IP-free safety solutions, a little bit different topic, but we want technology solutions that are free for others to practice it, that aren't held up by exclusive patent rights where it's incredibly costly to be able to access that technology. So if someone has a safety innovation, safety conscious companies frequently share that because it's pro-competitive. It's not something that companies really should, in my view, in our view, exploiting for economic gain. So we want solutions that foster creativity and development, especially around safety. This is a key policy goal that goes back to the 1990s and probably earlier, when the White House issued guidance around the development of national standards. When it comes to safety, we want sharing and IP solutions that make sense for the community that practice in those areas. And fortunately, we don't see a lot of roadblocks in this area, but this is just something that occasionally comes up in industries. And as products get more complex, being able to balance that policy goal is a reality. And the last thing is, we want to think about ways we can innovate around safety. So if we're connected to products today, notifications and alerts, they may sound kind of basic, but as time goes on, they will become more predictive. We'll get service predictions that will hopefully prevent field safety issues that come up. Consumers will get repair alerts notifying them to do things and repair. We'll have the ability to make modifications to products in a recall. That's already happening in real time. We see some of that. I know folks are aware of phone examples where you can brick a phone in a recall. That's probably the exceptional case, but there will be examples like that where we'll think more comprehensively about, look, what can I do with this connected product that does two things. One is alert consumers to service issues that aren't yet safety issues but could be, and that predictive capability is evolving, but it'll come, and it's something that's out there. We're seeing it in automotive applications. It's going to be in consumer products. It already is, but that's emerging. And I think consumers have to constantly be educated on these things, so they understand how to use products safely, but also we have to anticipate that they won't always follow that. So we touched on foreseeable misuse, and what does that mean? I think we'd all agree that there are some limits to that, but on the other hand, we can't put covers around our eyes and say, well, we can only use the product in this specific way, and if a consumer varies from that, then that's on the consumer. So companies have to really be smart about, well, look, I meant this, but I'm seeing some usage here that's not consistent with that, and we need to think about that as we're designing the product, because you cannot design all risk out of product. That's just a reality of most products, and as product complexity goes up, that's even more true. So I've talked a lot, so let me just stop there, Lisa, and see, do you have questions, anything else from the audience that we want to touch on?
Yeah, your final point, I'd like to just take a quick segue and connect the dots to the first webinar we had, which was keynote speaker, former CPSC chairman, Inez Tenenbaum. And for those of you who were with us on that webinar, she talked a lot about the challenges that the agency has faced and will continue to face in ensuring that with the limited resources they have and their tremendous oversight over consumer products as a whole, keeping up with the technology and with the innovation. And so, Michael, maybe you have some insight into how industries or organizations can really help support the commission. And we have international attendees as well, any oversight agencies and the staff that supports that work into really understanding the nuances of all of this and how to serve the consumer population most effectively.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Lisa. Thanks. I think this is an important point and one worth talking about for a little bit. The reality of an independent commission like the CPSC and other regulators is that they are charged with an enormous responsibility to regulate unbelievable complexity of products that exist out there. And the funding does not enable the commission to really fulfill its mission without partnership from stakeholders. And what does that mean in practice? Well, it means that CPSC is they are they punch way above their weight as an agency given their size and their funding. But industry's got to find ways to work collaboratively on safety issues. Got to do that through the product safety standards development process. I know that there's a lot written about well, that's too heavily slanted toward industry. I think from our perspective, we actually see a lot of stakeholders take part, as they should, in that process. It is it's not a perfect process, but fundamentally it is it encourages voluntary participation, and consumer groups can take part in that, and over time reduce risk and identify that. And CPSC, obviously their technical staff take part in the standards process, and that's a key part of how often, just speaking around safety standards and appliances, often the CPSC will commission a study. That study will identify risk, and then there's standards work that flows from that study. And that's been true in several examples where what got the ball rolling was the CPSC saying, well, here's a risk and here's some published data that they've aggregated and looked at, and then what to do about it. Now, it's one thing to say here's a risk, and then what to do about it is obviously puts and takes in discussion. And I know there's critique of, well, that process isn't perfect. Well, there's no process that's perfect. So it is a give and take. But I will say it's, over time, at least speaking from my experience in the home appliance industry, it's an area that's, I think, been, generally successful over time with some give and take. And I think that's true. You know, the other thing I'll add to that is product safety regimes in the US, North America, Europe, they are converging in many ways. So we see, you know, Europe, we're still kind of waiting to see the next phase of the European product safety regime that's kind of been long awaited. But, you know, with Health Canada entering in several years ago, and then Europe changing, and Australia and others, we just see, not that they're all the same, they have different principles, but some of the elements I talked about earlier, dealing with uncertainty, every regulatory regime has guidance or a regulation around what should companies do with respect to uncertainty. So the similarities of how those regimes look at safety, look at the precautionary principle, and provide guidance on, hey, what should companies do when they're faced with a potential risk? I think those elements are similar. And so one takeaway is I do think for those of us in safety roles at whatever level in the organization we're in, it's really incumbent upon us to participate in groups like this, hear dialogue. You don't have to agree with it, it's fine, but to hear the perspectives and kind of take into your organization's feedback on ways of thinking around these things, and then try to influence and be an influencer in your organization. I think that's really, to me, fundamentally important. And one of the ways we can help support the mission of the CPSC, Health Canada, other regulators, and try to maximize good outcomes over time. It doesn't mean no recalls. It doesn't mean that there won't be risks, but it does mean that over time, safety cultures are going to be improving, which is fundamentally a good thing.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michael. We are wrapping up our time here today. That was wonderful information, and we appreciate so much you sharing your expertise. It was great to chat with you and to have this dialogue today. So many key takeaways, and you know, we don't have time to rehash them all, but I did hear you say in one of our discussions that working through this process using technology to inspire innovation and serving as a leader is an art and a science. And I think that's something that is really important for all of us to remember. So, you know, keep doing the good work, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And our fourth and final webinar will take place this week also on Friday at 12 Eastern time. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you again, Michael. Thank you to Amazon, and have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you.